So, students, tell me if I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So, we are in the last part of our discussion on this topic. And as I said, that before we enter into the discussion on colonial philology, Orientalism, Indology, etc., it's important to also look at the trajectories of the spread of Persian in India. Hmm? Because that's another major classical language, and uh, I mean, it was a language uh, which was used uh, in the entire subcontinent and beyond. Hmm? So that's the language of power in that period as well. Um, so we have already explained in previous classes that what happened to Sanskrit. So in a sense, it continued; it didn't die. Um, so there is, I mean, any kind of narrative, we just simply think of its uh, replacement by any other thing might have its own problems. While of course there are newer developments that are also taking place. So as a pan-India language of power, uh, this new idiom emerges. Um, so that has significant implications for Sanskrit discourse as well. We have already seen in our previous discussions that Sanskrit was, for that matter, not a language of, as such, the political uh, administration, um, barring some exceptions. I mean, that happened in a certain period. Um, and then when this new classical language becomes widespread, uh, what kind of, I mean, additions, you can say, happens to the multilinguality in that period. Um, we have already seen in a certain ways, and we'll see more, the ways in which Sanskrit uh, was, I mean, uh, part of that vernacularization process as well. Hmm? Uh, when we were talking about Veena Narigal, or yeah, I mean, so we saw how, uh, for example, Marathi itself uh, was somewhat standardized um, through or in reference to Sanskrit. And this is something that kept happening in many other languages. And this is something which got uh, significantly augmented during the colonial period, but that is something that we will see in other topics. Now, I think before sorry, rather than giving you more um, explanatory remarks of this kind, let me just take on, this discussion on, um, I mean, uh, uh, some kind of a survey of the growth of uh, Persian language in India. Um, and it is this work by Muzaffar Alam, and I've already given you this reference from an edited volume by Sheldon Pollock. And this is a longish article. You can say it's almost a mini-size book running into a journal article running into, or sorry, um, 800 pages. So that's going to be the main reference point. But I hope, since you are already reading Christopher King's book, uh, you would be able to connect it. Yeah, what happened to Persian uh, with the arrival of the East India Company's rule, and then subsequently the direct rule of the British Queen, etc. So hopefully that, if time permitted today, otherwise tomorrow, that is something that we should take up. Hmm? Uh, in fact, Muzaffar Alam documented the trajectories of the interaction between Persian and other Indian languages. Fine. I mean, what kinds of interactions? I mean, how Persian was integrated in different languages, and what kind of influences on Persian were left by different regional cultures, languages, etc., etc. Um, and through this, actually, he lays emphasis on something more interesting, which is the distinct character acquired by Persian language in South Asia, distinct from the place of its origin in Iran. Okay, I mean, in other words, he shows the process of Indianization of Persian. Okay, and it is an irony, in fact, that it was discarded by the colonial rulers as a foreign language. So what Alam shows is the process of its Indianization. And then what is ironical is that subsequently the colonial rule dismisses it as a foreign tongue. Uh, and uh, it was displaced in the name of giving more importance to the vernaculars. So in North India, that meant obviously, I mean, Urdu and then Hindustani, and then subsequently, as you know, I mean, the whole debate on Nagari, which we shall discuss more in subsequent topics. Uh, but even in other places, so these were other languages. So Persian was replaced by vernaculars, including Urdu. However, actually, it was replaced in due course of time by another language of power, and that was perhaps more, I mean, surely equally, but perhaps even more alien. What was that? None other than English. Um, so you replace first the previous, I mean, the language which was the language of power in the previous regime, in the name of uh, giving more space to the vernaculars. And then subsequently, those vernaculars which lived until then uh, in interaction with Persian and Sanskrit and within their hegemonic influence, now uh, they have to live under the hegemonic superiority of English, right? So in both cases, I mean, they are living under the hegemonic influence of a language uh, supreme or power language, that ways. Okay, so we'll look at that hopefully with your inputs in greater detail in the next class. Or if time permitted, at the end of today's class, you would be requested to recall your reading of Christopher King. And yes, before I forget, let me also tell you uh, that the last text for the first internal assessment test uh, is uh, here it is. Yeah, this is Lisa Mitchell, Lisa. This reference is given in your synopsis and reading list that I've given you. Lisa Mitchell, Language, Emotions, and Politics in South India. Language, Emotions, and Politics in South India, the making of a mother tongue. Okay. And you have to read only chapter 1 and 6. Okay, which chapters you have to read? Chapter 1 and 6 of Lisa Marshall's book. Is that clear? Hmm?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, okay. Um, so with this, yeah. So let's move on. Okay. And when is our test? Just remind me. Friday.
So
When is
20,
that? Huh?
22nd, Tuesday.
Tuesday. Tuesday. Okay. So let's also fix that up. Tuesday. What we will do Tuesdays? What day? What date?
22nd.
22nd. Okay. So what are we going to do? Now we can have it perhaps. We have already decided to hold it in the evening. Yeah,
Yes, sir. At 6 p.m., sir.
at 6 p.m. Okay. So that has nothing to do with the class. The class will go as it is in the offline mode, but the test will be in Google Form in the evening at 6 p.m. Right? Okay. So let's then
Sir,
get.
uh, sir, we have to read Christopher King, the whole book, na, sir?
Yeah, I mean, I really thought that if I can leave something out, you can leave all those appendixes and those other things. Just read the chapters. Uh, Actually, there's one chapter which I could have skipped, but then that's the only chapter. Um, I think better look at it. I think there's nothing really that I can leave. Because chapter 3 onwards, it directly relates to what we're going to discuss. Hmm? And the first 2 chapters, I mean, they are conceptual chapters, so I really couldn't decide to leave them out. But chapter 3 onwards is directly related to, yeah, what we have to discuss in that controversy as well. So read it. I really don't. I tried my best to scratch something, but anyhow, you can at least read one book full. That's the only book I've asked you to read full. Others are articles, and then even this book I've just given you to read 2 chapters. In my MA previous, I have given them for 9 marks only, 3 full books. I mean, not full books, but almost full books. So anyhow, their test is over. You are still getting more this thing. So let's now move on. Okay. So uh, yeah. Now, so South Asia, the Indian subcontinent as such, it came in contact with the emergent new Persian culture sometime around the third quarter of the 9th century. Third quarter of the 9th century. It happened when Sindh was integrated into the Safavid kingdom. If you know, yeah, this is called the conquest of Sindh by Arabs, etc. Yeah. So um, when Sindh was integrated into the Safavid kingdom by this person called Yaqub bin Abi Faiz, and Persian, however, at this point of time was still evolving, uh, as a language of literary expression in the Islamic East. Um, uh, that's the end of the whatever, uh, the 9th century, and then the uh, yeah the presence of Persian, or you can, yeah, I mean, the presence of Persian language in Multan, um, um, Sindh, and Punjab in these areas, I mean, it got strengthened or some kind of a boost uh, because of the presence of these. We talked about them earlier also, Ismailis, yeah, in these regions, yeah. So I mean, they were the people who, I mean, Muslims who were otherwise very open, this thing, synchronistic in their attitude, and yeah. So their presence, I mean, they were also the Persians. They were speaking Persian. So and uh, but if for a far more formal relationship with Persian language, with the Indian subcontinent, uh, happened a bit later, a formal relationship as such. That happened in the wake of the establishment of Ghaznavite power in Punjab, and that's in the 11th century. Yeah, Ghaznavite power, the establishment of the Ghaznavite power in the 11th century. That's the time when some kind of a formal relationship of Persian with uh, the state power in this part of the globe, in this, like South Asia, happened with the establishment of the Ghaznavite power. Um, and it's therefore in the around, like in the area around his capital, that is Ghazna, Mahmud and his wazir, yeah, Ahmad, what was his name? Yes. So Mahmud, that is Mahmud Ghaznavi, Mahmud and his wazir, Khwaja Ahmad Mamandi, they created a major center of Persian culture in the 10th century, in Ghazna, basically. Okay. And now the interesting point here is that, Abu al-Faraz Runi, and I think we briefly mentioned him in another lecture earlier when I was talking about the work of Mary Shimil, but I think there's a lot more that we can talk about it now. So Abu al-Faraz Runi and Masood Saeed Salman, Masood Saeed Salman. These were the two. I mean, so Rooney and Salman, yeah, Salman, Masood Salman. They were the two major poets of this Ghaznavite era. Hmm? Uh, this was the context within which Firdausi also composed that very famous work called Shahnama. Okay. Uh, Later, in the wake of the Turkish conquest of North India in late 12th and early 13th centuries, Persian flourished further east in Delhi and beyond. Okay, the sultans of Delhi, that is between 1206, Iltutmish, yeah, and between 1206 to 1290, that, what is that called, the slave dynasty, yeah. So they extended generous patronage to Persian scribes, writers, and poets. When Genghis Khan invaded the Perso-Islamic land or Perso-Islamic world, what happened that scribes, savants, holy men, members of distinguished ruling families, men of learning, that is ulemas, and Sufis, They all migrated, a lot of them migrated into northern India. The Sultanate of Delhi patronized these men of learning and piety by giving them grants which were often located, land grants which were often located in the countryside. So what happened that as a result they were now going into the rural areas. Thus a gradual penetration of Persian into small towns and rural centers began through the beneficiaries of these state grants. Right? So similarly, what we find is that again in the wake of the empire building activities of Timur, Timur, yeah, that is in the late 14th century, additional Persian speaking groups sought refuge in northern India. When Genghis Khan attacked, they came to India. Additional Persian speaking groups came to India. Now, in the 15th century, the Afghan sultans of Delhi and Jaunpur. So, whom are we talking about? All these lodis, huh? So, the Afghan sultans of Delhi and Jaunpur encouraged their clansmen to settle in the Gangetic plains as far east as Bengal and Bihar. So then what is happening? Now these Persian speaking people are also reaching into Bengal and Bihar. Thus what we find is that by the 13th century, I mean from about 13th century onwards, there was a certain degree of cultural integration with a coherent Persian Islamic identity. It was in opposition to the Arab culture. It was in opposition to the Arab culture. This Persian identity was in opposition to the Arab culture, which was identified with the term Ajam, A-J-A-M. This Persian culture was identified with Ajam. So the Perso-Islamic identity that we are talking about developed, according to Muzaffar Alam, as something in opposition to the Ajam. Now remember these what is it? The word Ajam was used by the Arabs in the 1st century of Islam and even before that as a term of contempt. As a term, Ajam is a term of, in our subcontinent we use the term Mlecha, so they use the term Ajam. Ajam as a term of contempt for those they considered inferior to them in language and literature. Okay, so Arabs use the term Ajam for those who considered themselves, whom they considered as inferior to themselves in language and literature. Right? So it was thus, seized upon by, it is, how to put it? It was, this meaning that was seized upon and utilized by, self-assertive, in a self-assertive manner, not only by the, by those who lived on the Iranian plateau, this is the original homeland of Persian language, but also by those people who inhabited in the larger Persian speaking world, meaning this identification with a Perso-Islamic identity was happening not only by the Persian speaking people against the Ajam idea who were living in Iran, but also by the people living in, say, other areas, Faras, Bukhara, Afghanistan, Hindustan, and who was speaking Persian. Okay, so nonetheless, there were few other very important developments in the genre, in the um, uh, in the genre in Persian writing in South Asia. Very, very important developments that were taking place in the Persian genre in the South Asian countries. Okay, so there were also uh, um, uh, I mean, like, uh, yeah, these yeah, there were also some very, very significant changes in terms of style, not just the genre that we are, and we'll elaborate what do we mean by genres, but not just in the genre, also in style, uh, um, yeah, in style uh, that were developed in this subcontinent. Yeah. For example, this Masnavi, I don't know if you know Masnavi. It was a particular form of narrative poetry, Masnavi. Hmm? And if you know, I mean, like, who is associated with, there are actually these two things for which this person is known. One is called Masnavi, the other is called, but that's very funny, called Burkiyan. Of course, Muzaffar Alam talks about Masnavi only. This is associated with Amir Khusro. Hmm? So it's a different matter that this Masnavi form did not really flourish much after Amir Khusro. But whatever that may be, yeah, I mean, it was at that point of time, a new development, yeah. So, and then there were more important developments which even survived. I mean, Masnavis, of course, didn't survive, but a lot of other developments that took place in this period, they also survived. That may be seen in the field of lexicography, meaning, I hope you know, yeah, dictionaries banana, lexicography, and philology. A number of shorter poetic forms were also developed, such as ghazals. And I hope all of you know ghazals. In fact, um, this, what you say, um, meaning that Muzaffar Alam has given of the term ghazal, whether you agree with that or not, perhaps I don't love lyrics. What do you think? I mean, after all, this is about literature. Are there people who listen ghazals or read ghazals in the class? I hope all of you are not that boring. Are there people? सुनते हैं भाई, कोई गजल वजल सुनते हो, नहीं
Yes,
सुनते हो, या
सुनते हैं।
पढ़ते हो, सुनते हो? कौन से शायर या गायक कुछ याद है? नाम वाम?
Samir Taki Mir.
Very good. Very good. Anything that you know about Mir Taki Mir, or any verse that you can recall? I have some reason to ask this.
Some I remember that which has been adopted in the movie Bazaar. Fakirana I Sada Kar Churle is fun ke liye hum. I'm forgetting the last line. I mean, this is the line which is not there in the movie, but generally, which is I really like. Other one is the patta patta bhuta bhuta hal hamara jane na jane gul hi na jane baag to sara jane.
Very good. Very good. What's your name?
So Gaurav.
Okay. और कोई? भाई देखो, लैंग्वेज का कोर्स पढ़ रहे हो तो।
सर फैज अहमद फैज।
फैज अहमद फैज। चलिए, फैज अहमद फैज की बात करते हैं फिर। वैसे ये आधी बात इन्होंने भी खोल दी है। फैज अहमद फैज, भैया ये कैसी गजलें लिखते हैं?
सब बोल के लबाजाद है तेरे।
तो ये जो मुजफ्फर आलम ने डेफिनेशन दी है गजल की, अंग्रेजी मीनिंग, ये ठीक है। अगर फैज अहमद फैज इसको ध्यान में रखें तो, वैसे और भी हैं ऐसे, तो क्या इसको सिर्फ लव लिरिक कहना ठीक है? सोचिएगा। खैर, so ghazals, yeah, then also दास्तान। भाई वो दास्तान गोई सुनी है आपने कभी? हैं?
Yes, sir.
वो कौन है वो दो दास्तान गो जो बड़े फेमस हैं? तो ये तो तुम्हारे लॉकडाउन ने सब गड़बड़ कर दिया, नहीं तो इतना आसपास में होता रहता था। तो बैठे रहिए आप लोग वहीं अपने अपने इलाकों में। ये दिल्ली में इतना जो माल मसाला मिलता है ना, ऑल दैट वंडर्स ऑफ दिल्ली, दिल्ली गेट्स एवरीथिंग, देयर इज नथिंग इन द वर्ल्ड दैट यू डोंट गेट इन दिल्ली। सो इंटरेस्टिंग। सो महमूद ब्रदर्स इतना बढ़िया दास्तान गोई वो करते हैं आज भी। आई वाज जस्ट टेलिंग माय सन्स इन द मॉर्निंग about the storytelling, and this dastan गोई is something really, yeah. Then you have uh, the malfuzat. Now, malfuzats are something different. They are basically what do you say, conversations, uh, um, particularly uh, 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 amongst the Sufi saints. Okay. Um, they are generally, I mean, malfuzats are generally associated with the Sufi this thing. Yeah, I mean the recounting of the conversations of spiritual enlightened figures. That's called malfuza. Hmm? Okay, so these are forms that developed in South Asia, and then by the time of okay, leave it. Yeah. Yeah. So then, you know, what you see is that during the Delhi Sultanate, so to say, yeah, I mean by the early 16th century, from 13th to 16th century, Persian had fully evolved as a literary language throughout Central Asia. To take an interest in Persian arts and letters, to take an interest in Persian arts and letters was considered as a mark of refinement and sophistication. No monarch, howsoever brilliant and powerful militarily his achievements might have been, could aspire to fame, in the world of culture, whether at home or abroad, without generous patronage to Persian poets and scholars. Persian was the language of their courts, I mean the courts of these monarchs and rulers, and culture. Besides, you know, so then besides Delhi Sultanate, regional rulers such as in उच्च उच्च कहाँ पे था? उच्च कहाँ पे था बताइए? अभी तो आपको नेटवर्क देना है जिनको नहीं हुआ है। उच्च कहाँ पे था? खोजिएगा। सो
सेंट्रल एशिया।
देखिए, ये आप वही वाली बात कर रहे हैं जैसे हमारे एक बड़े क्या कहते हैं, नामी गिरामी राजनीतिज्ञ ने, नाम नहीं लूंगा, तक्षशिला को कहाँ बता दिया था? तक्षशिला कहाँ था? तक्षशिला कहाँ था? अरे वे बता दो, नहीं तो उनमें और हम आप में फिर फर्क नहीं समझ में आएगा।
So it's in Pakistan.
Peshawar, Pakistan.
और बिहार में तो नहीं था ना, लेकिन तो गूगल कर लेना कि कौन कहता है कि बिहार में था. हाँ? खैर, तो yes, so I mean the rulers in Uch and Multan, for example, uh, I mean hugely patronized and promoted Persian language and literature. For example, this Prince Muhammad, who was the son of Balban, he was the governor of Multan, and he was a great patron of Persian literature. So his assembly in Multan included a lot of accomplished Persian scholars and poets, and this included Amir Khusro and Hassan Delvi. Okay, so and you know, it is said that this Prince Muhammad twice invited the great Persian poet called he twice invited this great Persian poet called Sheikh Saudi to visit India from Shiraz. Now, I mean, it is said that Muhammad even sent Mahmud even sent travel expenses to Sadi, you know, that please come and I'm sending you the travel expenses. However, he declined on account or on pretext or on the grounds of, you know, growing age, etc., etc. But then it is also said that he, I mean, it is also reported that you know, he said that why do you need me if you've got Amir Khusro? Why do you need Saudi? So that kind of, yeah. Now, one more indicator of the spread of Persian in Persian literary culture in South Asia could be seen in the publication, oh sorry, in the preparation of Lubab. Lubab is a kind of biography of Persian literature. I mean, it could be biography of any language. Yeah. So Lubab is a literary biography, and it I mean was compiled in 1222 at Uch. I think this date a little doubtful. We'll have to check. Another index of the spread of Persian as a language of culture is that I mean that can be seen in the growth of the corpus of translations, yeah, of the Arabic classics into Persian. So a lot of people in India translated a lot of Arabic texts into Persian. Okay. Now, I mean, it could be said so far that, you know, we've been talking about the rulers and the states and their courts. So the Persian language is therefore spread by primarily through the agency of the state. And therefore it's the language of the state in that sense, yeah. But the real spread requires much more. And what we are talking about is the process of its Indianization. So the world of Persian literary culture was not confined to political elite alone. The interaction of Persian with other languages was far more widespread. It reflects Indianization of Persian as well as its autonomy from the Iranian literary canon. And that's something very important. If we have to understand its Indianization, we have to also understand how it was securing, its separate identities, distinct identity. Yeah. So one good example of this interaction, of Persian with other South Asian languages could be seen in the um, kind of smattering or in the presence of Hindu words, concepts, and metaphors in Persian language. Okay, I mean, so basically, when we say Hindu, basically what we're talking about is the non-Persian words derived from the different languages of India. How they became, I mean, the fact that many of these words, metaphors, etc., began to be used and incorporated in this Persian language in the way it developed in India, that in itself is an example of its interaction with other languages. So what we find is that words such as Pani, Chandan, Rana, and Tal, Pani, Chandan, Rana, Tal, appear in the early verses written in Persian language in South Asia. The teeth of the beloved are compared to red rubies, reflecting the chewing of beetle. Okay, and beetle is used here. In this Persian poetry, rain clouds, or rather than the breeze, carry the message from the lover to the beloved. Okay, so that's, I mean, you see how, I mean, whatever is there in the Indian seasonal patterns, or in the Indian flora, so that becomes the metaphors in the Indian Persian. Similarly, the notion of the Bahar, there was this very famous, I don't know if you know about it, book called Bago Bahar. But anyhow, so the notion of Bahar or spring was virtually transformed in Salman Masood's Persian poetry. He identified Bahar as the Indian rainy season. It's not the spring here, it's the Indian rainy season. Bahar कब आ रही है? जब सावन आ रहा है, right? So सावन से उसको identify कर लीजिए. In the same manner, Masood's description of the Persian months, days, and weeks are identical in form and in intent to a South Asian genre which was called Baramasa. Baramasa, yeah, were basically the songs relating to the 12 months cycle, which were found in medieval poetry all over North India. Okay, so in Amir Khusro's poetry at the beginning of the 13th century, this autonomy or Indian identity became more pronounced. Khusro excelled in almost all the forms and genres that we've talked about so far. He innovated upon the traditions of earlier masters and thereby set an example for the later Indian poets. He rose so much in prestige that even some of the great poets outside India like Jami took pride in imitating him. Khusro even identified his Persian as Hindavi, the language of India. Okay. However, subsequently, Indian Persian distanced itself from such folk contexts. That happened subsequently, and that we will talk about. It is possible that because of the royal and urban character of Persian, interaction with Indian rural folk poetic traditions was regarded as beneath Persians' stature. I repeat, it is possible that because of the royal and urban character of Persian, interaction with Indian rural folk poetic traditions was regarded as beneath Persian stature. Still, the still the commoners, the soldiers, became familiar with these uh, uh, Persian specimens of poetry and carried them. The common people and the soldiers, they became familiar with these specimens of Persian poetry and carried them to places generally inaccessible to the new immigrants. Sufi centers, which are called Khanqah, as you know. Yeah, Sufi center were another religious institution that played a critical role in publishing the in popularizing the Persian language and in encouraging the evolution of a Persian literary tradition. The Sufi center was the common meeting ground for a wide range of people cutting across religious affiliation. The desire of the devotee, this is very important, the desire of the devotee to learn Persian, in I mean that desire got intensified, when they realize, when these devotees realize that their Sufi masters Malfuzats, and I just explained to you what are the Malfuzats. Yeah, the Sufi masters Malfuzats, that is conversations, uh, their letters and other writings were in Persian language. So then why not learn Persian if you want? If I'm a Sufi devotee of a master and if I want to know more about him, then it is better that I learn Persian language. Yeah. So the Sufi authors, particularly the Chishtis, in also integrated the local ideas, phrases, and poetic expressions in their texts. Why? Because they wanted to reach out to the common people. So they wanted to simplify it. And how will they simplify it? By using the local expressions, poetic forms, and ideas, right? So what you see is that, these Sufi centers emerged as a significant institution of the spread of Persian language, and not just that centers of the spread of Persian language, but also of the integration between Persian languages and other Indian vernaculars. Right? So works like Panchatantra, Chintamani, uh, works like Panchatantra, uh, Chintamani Bhatt's it is called what's the title? Yeah, Sukh Saptati and Hatha Yoga. These were translated in Persian language. As these works circulated, meaning these translated versions circulated, what happened? That these stories and other contents of these books, yeah, would trickle down back to Indians, or the Indian people. How? Because now, like, they have been translated in Persian. So the Persian speaking people are also coming to know about those ideas. They're also talking about them, right? So then what is happening is that the reader is getting a situation where, here she can compare what the Persian representation as well as the, story in which he heard it from, through the word of the mouth, right? So the indigenous imagery thus gradually became a part of Persian literary style through the translations of Indian texts, right? These developments show the expanding territory of Persian and also imply its gradual Indianization. Only 4 dictionaries were compiled in Iran during the 1,000 years period between 10th to 9th to 19th century. How many? How many dictionaries were compiled in Iran during this period of 1,000 years?
4.
Okay, only 4 dictionaries. In India, on the other hand, in the same period, uh, at least 66, at least 66 dictionaries were compiled in the same period. Okay, there could be more. Now, what does this mean? If the proliferation of dictionaries signifies the dissemination of the language, which of course it does, yeah, then it also reflects the concern of the purists who wanted to protect and promote a high literary culture and to ensure conformity to the universal standards of language. So it shows both the things. What it shows, at one end, it shows that the language is spreading. That is why more dictionaries are being prepared. And on the other hand, it also reflects the desire of the purists to protect the language to maintain its universal standards. Both the things. Right? Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Um, no, on the other hand, in just one second, I lost it. Is this gone? Yeah. Now in India, in the 16th century saw 16th century saw enhancement of regional literary cultures. Okay, for instance, sultans of Jaunpur, uh, uh, sorry, sultans of um, uh, okay, yeah. So it saw regionalization or growth of regional, literary cultures. So, I mean, for example, you see, this Sultan Ibrahim Shah, hmm, or Sultan Adil Ibrahim Shah, uh, uh, who, I mean, became the ruler of Bijapur. Um, uh, in what is the period? Yeah, 16th century. I mean, 1534 basically. So Sultan, this Ibrahim Adil Shah, when he became the ruler of Bijapur in 1536, he proclaimed a he proclaimed Hindavi. Hmm? And here it means Hindavi. Here means Marathi, because which is the area that we are talking about? Hmm? Bijapur is where? It will be where? Hmm? I mean,
Deccan, India, Deccan.
yeah. So he declared basically a present day Maharashtra kind of, Deccan area. So he declared Hindavi, basically Marathi, as the language of his government. He entrusted all the important administrative and financial offices to the Brahmins. Further, we find that Barid Shahi Sultan, yeah, Barid Shahi Sultanate of Bidar, yeah, that also issued some bilingual inscriptions, in both, that is Persian and Marathi languages. In Golconda, the vernacular was given the uh, honor of being the language of the Sultan. Okay. Uh, um, uh, this Ibrahim Qutb Shah encouraged the growth of Telugu. Similarly, his successor, Muhammad Quli Qutb Shah, patronized and himself wrote poetry in Telugu and Dakkini. Right? Uh, Abdul Qutb Shah instituted a special office to prepare royal edicts in Telugu language. So, it's very complex. While administrative and revenue papers at local levels in Qutub Shahi Sultanate were prepared largely in Telugu, the royal edicts were often bilingual, meaning they were in both. I mean, the local work, of course, took place in Marathi or Telugu, sorry, in this case, but the royal edicts were in both languages, that is Telugu as well as Persian. The last Qutub Shahi Sultan, that is uh, Abu Sal Hassan, Abu Sal Hassan issued his orders only in Telugu with a Persian summary given on the back of royal edicts. Fine. North India also witnessed the elaboration of Hindavi, which gradually incorporated much of Persian culture, in particular through Sufi centers and then expressed it forcefully in its poetry. So, according to Muzaffar Alam, then, they developed an independent diction in poetry under Mughal uh, uh, and this growth of an independent diction, Persian diction, under the Mughals, in fact, marked the zenith of Indian Persian. Now, difficult, terse, and abstract ideas of uh, uh, Indian languages and cultures were integrated into Persian. As India drew close to Iran, yeah, I mean, that's what you see happening in this period. As India drew closer to Iran culturally, Persian began to attain status as the first language of the king of Mughal court. First language of the king and the Mughal court. This is how, I mean, like in say the reign of Akbar, it starts happening. I mean, like they go closer to the Iranian Empire. Yeah, you can read that history. So, and that's how, I mean, that's also simultaneously you see the growth in the status of Persian. Akbar was the first amongst the Indo-Muslim kings who Indo-Muslim kings of North India who formally declared Persian to be the language of administration at all levels. So Akbar was the first to do this. The Iran, sorry, the Iranians were seen everywhere in the government offices as officials and minor functionaries, even though they were not in you can say exclusive control of the office, but they were seen everywhere. Yeah? A substantial part of the administration was carried out by the indigenous Hindu communities who had earlier uh, communicated official duties, whatever, in some form of Hindui. But now they also began to learn Persian and joined the Iranians as uh, clerks, scribes, and secretaries. Hindus, particularly Kayastas and Khatris, yeah, they joined madrasas in large numbers to acquire training in the Persian language and literature. This now promoted good careers, that is the knowledge of Persian, now promoted good careers in uh, the imperial house or in the imperial service. Initially, the teachers in these whatever schools or madrasas were often from Farsi and from Faras and Shiraz. Originally, the teachers in these institutions were from Faras and Shiraz, etc. But in due course of time, Indians, including Hindu teachers, also began to teach. Okay. Many religious scriptures were translated in full into Persian by individual Hindu authors. However, there was also an irony. I've been talking about the spread and integration, but there was also an irony. We uh, peculiar kind of an irony of this period of the Mughal Empire. What is the irony? I'll just explain. Give me a second. Yes. So, what is the irony about the? I mean, Mughal period has to be the what the I mean the zenith, yeah, the peak of the effervescence of Persian. But then there is an irony. Uh, See, earlier, what was happening? Earlier, Persian was seen and projected more as the language of a culture, larger culture. Okay. However, as a consequence of the political things, various political activities or developments of the 14th and the 15th centuries in Iran, what happened that Persian was now increasingly represented as the language exclusively of that country. Okay, rather than, I mean, as a language of the larger culture now, and of course we can't here go into the details of that. Some of that, of course, you can read in Alam's work. Persian was identified more as the language of that country. Okay, accordingly, what happened that instead of being treated as instead of being treated as part of an Ajam wide Persian literary culture, instead of being treated as part of a larger literary culture, what you find is that Mughal uh, literary culture was virtually subordinated to the Iranian. The Mughal literary culture was virtually, I mean, this is the zenith of the development of Persian language in India. But what is ironical here is that now, and I'll explain why this happened, I mean, how this happened, but what I'm telling you right now is that it became more, I mean, it is seen as subordinate to Iran. Earlier, that wasn't the case. And I'll explain how. Yeah. This is reflected, for example, in the narrow world of the Tazkiras. This is reflected very much in the narrow world of the Tazkiras, because what is happening in the Tazkiras? Tazkira mein kya ho raha hai that, I mean, like the Indian poets are not listed, in the Tazkiras on Persian language prepared in, say, Iran, the Indian then, so they're not included. Fine. So in the compilation of the Tazkiras, in particular, I mean, those Tazkiras which were compiled in Iran, and then in the raising controversy around Indian usage, and in the definition and assessment of good poetry. In all these things, I mean, let me explain this. For a while, uh, let me put it this way. While Indian Persian diction matured under the Mughals, and of course it did mature, Iranian idiom remained to be the reference point. This is reflected very much in the concern for the purification of Persian language, a concern expressed by Akbar himself. Purification of Persian language. A concern for that was even expressed by none other than the great Akbar the Great. Akbar had asked Jamal al-Din, what is his name? Jamal al-Din Hussein, Jamal al-Din Hussein of Shiraz, to prepare in his name a lexicon with the objective of purging the language of non-Iranian words and expressions. What is the objective of this lexicon, of this dictionary, which is to be prepared by this gentleman in the name of Akbar? That it has to, this dictionary has to purge Persian language from all those words which are non-Persian. Okay, this practice of Mughal lexicon was in sharp contrast to the approach of pre-Mughal Persian authors such as Amir Khusro of early 14th century, because he had disapproved of the Khurasani idiom and had noted that Indian Persian was written and pronounced according to the standards of Turan, not Iran. What Amir Khusro said, that Indian Persian is written and expressed with reference to the standards of Turan. Turan is what? Turan is what? बता दो भाई. Turan is what? हाँ? फिर से बोलिए. मैं नहीं समझ पा रहा हूँ. तुरान किसे बोल रहे हैं?
अफगानिस्तान के ऊपर जो
well, I don't know whether it's Afghanistan or Turkestan, or maybe from Afghanistan to Turkestan. That needs to be find out. But surely what he says is that होगी ईरान की पैदाइश, पर हम ईरान के हिसाब से नहीं बोलते हैं. हमारे तो जो रूलर्स हैं वो तुर्की के हैं, है ना? These are the Turks. We are talking of the early Sultanate period. So these are Turks. So then we don't follow. Even though when we speak Persian, we don't follow the style in Iran. We follow the Turani style. Okay, and for the lexicographer of the 14th century, the speech current in their own areas represented nothing but nothing but dialects of the same Persian tongues. They thought of their own dialects as nothing different but dialects of the same Persian tongue. So they, एक तो वो कह रहे हैं कि जो स्टैंडर्ड है हमारा वो भी that's not the Iran, that's Turan. And then the other thing that you find is that, the thing that, I mean, like when people prepared the dictionaries in their own areas, they integrated a lot of local terms in those dictionaries. Why? Because they thought that, whatever speech, whatever language that we have in that particular area, whichever that area, is basically a tongue, a speech form of Persian only. With that understanding, that may be right or wrong is a different question. But there's something else that will unfold just in a short while. Yeah. What does it imply? It implies basically an adherence to a much pluralist, wider understanding. And it is quite different from what we saw in Akbar later on. Yeah? Because Akbar is more concerned about the fact that all the non-Irani words, I mean, all the Desaj words, the indigenous words, should be purged from this language. That's the idea. The period of its efflorescence in India is the period for Alam, is a period when it acquires a distinct character from, I mean, like it's at one end, Iran is identifying Iran Persian as its own language, not as the language of the wider Persian speaking community. And on the other hand, what is happening is that when Persian is being developed here, it's getting dissociated itself from, the inheritance that it had from other languages so far. Hmm. और ये बहुत important. This is very important because very often you will see this, yeah, when people talk of developing a language, they actually freeze it from its fluidity, from its, transcultural, multilingual context. It can happen even today like that. Okay. So, I mean, their lexicons, I mean, the lexicons of these 14th century people, their lexicons included words used in Faras as well as in, mm, uh, Samarkand and in Turkestan, etc., etc. Yeah, they often provided Hindawi synonyms for Persian words. That's how it's happening in the 14th century, which is quite different from, what was happening in the late 16th century under Akbar, I mean, under the Mughals. Yeah. So on the other hand, what you see is that the attempts during the Mughal period by Indian Persian to acquire an autonomous position, for instance, as we saw, were made by Arzu and, I mean, the other poets of that period. Um, you know, uh, I mean, those efforts were feeble. Yeah. Uh, to assert its own distinctness. Those efforts in this period of time were to be rare. Okay. Moreover, the as part of the production of taskiras in this period, that is in the 18th century in India, with an unusually confident emphasis on what was good in Persian literature, that also meant that Indian achievements were quite significant, and we need to document it. And why we need to document? Why do we need to emphasize the fact that Indian achievements were very important because, you know, otherwise the Persian tazkiras written in Iran, they are not recognizing it, right? These were scarcely noticed by later Iranian uh, uh, critiques and and and, uh, uh, critiques and writers. Yeah. In contrast to the early uh, in contrast to the early tazkiras, in contrast to the early tazkiras, wherein the world of Persian stretched far wide, I mean, from say India to Caspian Sea, and the Safavid Empire in the Safavid and the post-Safavid Empire. What you see is that Persian was now accorded an exceptionally uh, preeminent position as the language of Persia. Okay, so I'll just skip that part, and I just come basically, to the fact that according to Muzaffar Alam, the backbone of Persian, of this Persian, was actually broken under the British regime, whatever that may be. Like, I mean, even though there was this problem, what is the problem during the Mughal? What is the problem during the Mughal, if you have understood it? This is a period when it developed, fine. But then what is the problem, or what are the problems? What are the problems that he's talking about under the Mughal period? What is the irony? Come on, please, yeah? It's very important that you understand it correctly. That's why I'm asking you. What is the irony of the Mughal period and Persian, the development of Persian that Muzaffar Alam is talking about?
मे बी सर इट इज लाइक कि इसका ओरिजिन जो है वो ईरान से हुआ है, बट मुगल पीरियड में वो उससे मतलब डिसोसिएट कर रहा है अपने आप को और एक डिस्टिंक्ट आइडेंटिटी फॉर्म कर रहा है, जिसके अंदर रीजनल लैंग्वेजेस के भी कुछ वर्ड्स और वर्नाकुलर के भी देखने को मिल रहे हैं।
नहीं, इनफैक्ट ठीक उसका उल्टा, ये तो पहले हो रहा है। आई एम सेइंग मुगल पीरियड में क्या हो रहा है? Why is there an irony in the Mughal period? What is the irony of the Mughal period? ये तो हो ही रहा है जो आप बता रही हैं, पर फिर मुगल पीरियड में क्या चेंज हो रहा है? वही तो कॉम्प्लेक्स चीज है जो मैं समझाना चाह रहा हूँ। Anybody else, please? Look at your notes in case you could take down anything. What is the irony in the Mughal period of the Mughal period that Muzaffar Alam is talking about? ये कैसे हो सकता है यार? किसी को तो कुछ समझ आया और नहीं आया तो क्या होगा? हाँ? Yes. Yes. Nobody understood. Then why didn't you ask me? Anjali? कोई तो बोलिए यार।
Sir.
Yes.
So the irony of the British period was that they dismissed Persian. So Mughal. Oh, so I thought it was British period.
No. What is the irony of the Mughal period that Muzaffar Alam is talking about? Anybody else? Ashutosh? आयुषी? अरे कोई तो बता दो यार, ऐसे भी मत करो. What you got, just speak out that. Let me then correct it in case there's some problem. I mean, there's no minus marking about it. Yeah. Since you did not ask this, if you didn't understand, that's why I'm asking you. Okay. So, what we'll do is that I hope that you can listen back to what I spoke today, or just go back to Muzaffar Alam's essay and look at it. And then tomorrow, when we resume, we'll take that up first. Yeah. And then move on. Okay. Maybe you're tired at the end of the day. Okay. So I'll stop here. And then tomorrow we'll take it on from here. And please, I mean, apart from this essay, this is very, very important. I hope tomorrow you would be able to relate it to the work of Christopher King. I think it is in chapter 2 or 3. I don't remember. You can check it, where he does talk about, what happened to Persian and how it was replaced with the vernaculars, etc., etc. So we'll take that up tomorrow. Okay. And I hope you have already read, most of you, at least that chapter, hopefully the whole book. So we can also talk about it tomorrow when we meet. Yeah. Before we begin with the next topic, because tomorrow I want to start with the next topic or next subtopic, whatever. Okay. Fine. So tomorrow we'll start with the next subtopic, but before that we'll continue or conclude this discussion on Persian with some hope that tomorrow we can talk about the irony that I was trying to explain today, or you can read it in the book, and then we'll talk about the next subtopic. Yeah. Sorry. Then we'll talk about what happened to Persian during the colonial period, and then. In fact, there the major onus lies on you because you have read. So I will only facilitate the discussion. And then I will begin with the next topic, subtopic. Okay.